Imagine being born just 34 years after a system of slavery that lasted 250 years was officially abolished. The traces of slavery are still alive in your family. You grow up with memories that are still too fresh to fade while being passed from one generation to the next. Your mother dies when you are 15. Your father, trying to educate you and your two sisters, works as a laborer in factories, while also making a living through farming. At 23, you become a nurse. To serve your country and your own people, you choose to work in public health. Before long, you become a public health worker who reaches thousands, reduces child mortality, and improves families' living conditions. People notice what you do. You become one of the first African Americans employed by the United States Public Health Service. You don't just take a position, you open a door for the people of color who will come after you. And years later, you become the third person to receive the Oveta Culp Hobby Award, the highest honor the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare can give to an employee. And yet, while everything seems to be moving in that direction, how did it happen that, in a single day, you were declared one of the biggest culprits of one of the most unethical research studies in human history? How did you go from being a public health nurse, serving your country and community, to becoming an African American woman who drew the hatred of everyone? Can we really understand, in the moment, where the steps we take with good intentions will lead? And maybe the hardest question of all, in a study recognized as one of the most racist scientific experiments in the world, what made accepting that role feel justifiable? This channel is called Would You Choose This? And in this video, we will look at an experiment that broke completely away from ethical boundaries, not from the surface, but through a wider context. We will talk about how a person, within their own socio-cultural world, can make choices they believe are right and still end up making the wrong decision. And we will ask the most unsettling question: if you had been in the same place, would you truly have made a different choice? By 1928, syphilis, a disease that had existed in the United States for centuries, was rising again, especially in the southern states. It wasn't affecting only individuals. It was affecting unborn children, families, and rural communities that were already fragile. So, in areas believed to have high infection rates, a rural public health program was launched with the support of the Julius Rosenwald Fund. To slow transmission as much as possible and reduce the impact of the disease in those already infected, screenings were conducted in rural parts of Alabama, educational sessions were held, and the best possible outcomes were targeted. But then came the Great Depression of 1929. It didn't only crush banks, it hit public health programs like this too. The Rosenwald Fund withdrew its support, and this large-scale public health effort was left unfinished. About 3 years later, in 1932, one of the doctors working for the United States Public Health Service, Taliaferro Clark, revisited the half-abandoned project. One place in particular caught his attention: Alabama, Macon County, and within it, a small town, Tuskegee. According to Clark, in a region where previous screenings suggested a high rate of syphilis, running a 6-month observation study seemed reasonable. The plan was simple, at least on paper. Observe the natural course of the disease for 6 months, and then, at the appropriate stages, administer the available treatments. Clark presented it as low cost, scientifically useful, and in a country going through hard times, reasonable. Under the shadow of the Great Depression, the idea of understanding a disease that was derailing people's lives felt like an opportunity, and the study was approved. But the daily living conditions of African American men in the region did not match the simplicity of that plan on paper. Most of the black population in Macon County were poor farmers. Most had no regular access to a doctor. Hospitals were far away, health care was expensive, and their contact with the state was often limited to military service, taxes, or punishment. So when the United States Public Health Service came into the area and put up notices for men over 25, many assumed it was a draft notice and almost no one signed up. So the health officials changed their approach. They pulled back the scientific language, they softened the voice of the state, and they put at the center a figure the community would trust, a public health nurse who knew the people, spoke their language, and shared their skin color. Eunice Rivers. The study was no longer seen as a government research project. It started being referred to as Miss Rivers Lodge. Free examinations, transportation support, hot meals, and most importantly, trust. And slowly, the men began to come. And at that moment, no one knew that 6 months would stretch into 40 years. There was a problem no one was saying out loud. The screening results didn't come back the way they expected. The infection rate was roughly 20%, and to create a meaningful sample with real treatment, they would have needed thousands more screenings, meaning a lot more money. And while the Great Depression still weighed on everything, the Rosenwald Fund informed them it could no longer cover the treatment process and withdrew its support. Mass treatment was no longer an option, officially, and in front of the researchers, a quiet choice appeared. Either they would end the process right then and there, or they would keep a small group already known to be infected, already without access to treatment, under long-term observation. As the Rosenwald Fund stepped away, something else happened that would shape the future. The man who had launched the project with the idea of 6 months of observation, then treatment, Dr. Taliaferro Clark, resigned from the project in 1933. The reason for his resignation was never clearly documented. And at that point, the person left standing on the ground, in the community, was Miss Eunice Rivers. The men trusted her. Who the project director was, which doctor resigned, or who replaced him. None of that meant anything to them. For them, only one thing was meaningful: a nurse who knew them, who entered their homes, who knew their children, who was one of them, who seemed to be bringing the state's health care to their doorstep. After the funding was pulled and Clark was gone, the direction of the study changed at its core. For the new people in charge, the goal was no longer treatment. It was to watch how the disease progressed without treatment. Even if it took years, even if the men suffered, even if they died. Even death itself became part of the research. This was no longer a public health project. It was an experiment designed to document the long-term effects of untreated syphilis on the human body. In this study, the men were no longer patients. They were subjects. A total of 600 men were enrolled, 399 with syphilis, 201 in the control group. All of them black, poor, living in rural areas, and many of them unable to read or write. Over time, participation began to drop, so a new method was introduced. They didn't explain it in medical language, they explained it in everyday language. You have bad blood. Bad blood in black communities at the time was a frightening catch-all term that could mean many illnesses, including syphilis. Believing that their bad blood was being cleaned, the men stayed in the study. They weren't receiving treatment, but they needed to believe they were. They were given tonics, aspirin, vitamins. A painful and extremely risky procedure, the lumbar puncture, was presented as their last chance for treatment. But it wasn't treatment. It was simply a method of collecting data. Instructions were sent out to local health staff, including local black health workers, and to mobile health teams established to control the growing number of sexually transmitted diseases across the country. Those instructions said, "These men are part of a federal study. Their treatment is closed to outside interference. No referrals and no treatment should be provided, because any possible treatment was seen as a risk to the study's scientific integrity." By the 1940s, the scope of the study expanded again. The goal was no longer only to observe them while they lived. They wanted to examine their bodies after they died, too. And that created a new risk for the researchers: the possibility of not being able to reach the men's funerals. So they offered another guarantee: free burial services. But there was a condition: permission for an autopsy. For Black communities, funeral rituals were sacred, and having the state cover burial costs felt like luck, like relief. Many accepted the offer. In 1941, as the United States began drafting soldiers for World War II, the subjects received draft notices. 250 Black men, eligible by age, set off to join the Army for their country. They were put through the Army's mandatory medical screening, and the Army saw that a large portion of them had syphilis. Under normal circumstances, the procedure was clear. If syphilis was detected, the person would be treated and then either enlisted or given temporary exemption. But this file wasn't ordinary, even for the Army. To prevent the Army from beginning treatment, the United States Public Health Service stepped in directly, and official correspondence was exchanged. In those letters, the Army was informed that the men from Tuskegee were part of a special government study and were already under observation and monitoring. And one critical sentence was used: "Treating these individuals for syphilis will compromise the integrity of the study." This wasn't a hint, it was a direct instruction, and as a result, the Army sent the infected men back without treating them. And from that point on, it wasn't only health institutions or the government. The American military, too, had become part of this experiment. So much so that, at one point, Army officials asked the people running the Tuskegee study, "Should we treat the Tuskegee men here who have syphilis, or should we send them back to you?" That question alone shows exactly what this experiment had become. Let's pause the scene. Let's stop for a moment. At this point, there was still no widely available, safe, and universally accessible treatment for syphilis. No one had openly said, "Let these people die." But by now, everyone knew one thing. This study was no longer a 6-month observation. And this shift didn't happen because of a single dramatic decision. It happened through small, technical choices. A budget was canceled. A doctor resigned. New doctors arrived and made their own decisions. No one shouted. No one stood up and left the table. No one said, "We need to stop." What was really happening there? This study had originally been designed to look like a public health initiative. The goal was simple: to observe how untreated syphilis progressed in the short term, and then apply the most appropriate treatment of the time. The face of the study in the field was someone the local community trusted: Miss Eunice Rivers. She was using her profession for the health of her own community. But with the impact of the Great Depression, the Rosenwald Fund withdrew. The possibility of treatment disappeared, and what remained were 600 men gathered under the message, "The government has come to take care of you." 399 of them had syphilis. A group this large, living with untreated syphilis for such a long time, barely existed anywhere else. And right at that point, the study made a conscious shift from curing the disease to observing the disease. This was not a secret underground operation. It was a process known within federal institutions, carried out through official correspondence, and reported in medical circles. But for the subjects, it was not transparent. They didn't know what they were part of. Now let's take a step back. calling this study one of the darkest, most racist, and most unethical experiments in history. Reducing it to a single moment, a single decision, or a single person would not be fair. The first major ethical violation was this: informed consent was never obtained from these men. The second violation was more subtle. Instead of asking the men how they would respond to treatment, researchers made assumptions based on their own worldview. They interpreted the men's past lack of access to health care as a choice and said they wouldn't want treatment anyway. But the reality on the ground was completely different. When Miss Eunice Rivers became involved, these men felt seen by the state for the first time. They accepted free examinations, care, and guidance. So the issue wasn't that they didn't want treatment. The issue was that they had never had a real choice before. The moment they agreed to participate, that assumption had already collapsed. Now let's look at the historical context. To truly understand this study, we also need to look closely at the years it took place. This is America in the 1930s. Slavery had officially ended, but at an institutional level, no one was acting as if black and white people were equal. This wasn't just personal prejudice, it was structural racism. Structural racism makes certain things possible, seeing some bodies as more suitable for risk, seeing some lives as more expendable in the name of science. At the time, racial hierarchies were being legitimized through the language of science. Today, we call this scientific racism. A common claim circulated in medical circles. Syphilis was believed to affect the nervous system more in white patients, and the cardiovascular system more in black patients. This claim wasn't based on strong scientific evidence. It was rooted in a centuries-old prejudice, the idea that black people were intellectually inferior, and a disease like syphilis, known for mimicking many other illnesses, seemed like the perfect tool to prove those beliefs. There were other studies on syphilis during this period. The first, the Oslo study, conducted in Norway. Between 1890 and 1910, there had been a clinical period in which thousands of syphilis patients were observed without medication. The Oslo study later analyzed these cases retrospectively, years after the patients had died. Because the data analysis was conducted posthumously, it was considered acceptable within the ethical standards of that era. All of the patients in the Oslo study were white, and crucially, the conclusion of the Oslo study was not syphilis should not be treated, but the opposite. It demonstrated why syphilis must be treated. The second, the Guatemala experiments. The second study, when viewed today, is at least as disturbing as Tuskegee. In the 1940s, with the support of the United States Public Health Service, prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and sex workers in Guatemala were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea. The goal was explicit: to observe how the disease spread and how different bodies responded. What was done in Guatemala was considered something that could be tested outside America. Tuskegee revealed something even more unsettling. The same mindset could be applied to America's own citizens, especially black bodies. And there was another cultural layer. Syphilis, even if it wasn't openly said, was often seen as a deserved disease. Yes, white people also had syphilis. But because it was sexually transmitted, it was tied to immorality, treated as a harsh social taboo. These men suffered from syphilis, and some died. But the culture around them treated that suffering as something they had already earned. The disease became systematically a tool for blaming the victim. And at some point, a mental shift happens. The moment you stop seeing an illness as a disaster that happens to a person and start seeing it as a natural consequence of who they are, you start making decisions without even realizing you've decided. Second breaking point: deliberately not using a known solution. Over the years, the study slid into a place where one assumption became unquestioned. These men wouldn't want treatment anyway. But the irony was this: even if this team had never entered these men's lives at all, at least two real opportunities for treatment would have appeared in front of them. First, mobile health services established to fight sexually transmitted diseases. Second, the United States military. Under normal circumstances, both systems follow a clear logic. If syphilis is detected, treatment is provided. But for the Tuskegee subjects, both paths were deliberately blocked. And here's the real rupture. These decisions weren't the initiative of one doctor, one nurse, or one institution. This was the normalization of deliberately not applying a known solution. And that's what turned Tuskegee from a single ethical violation into a systematic crime. In the early 1940s, penicillin was still in the trial phase as a treatment for syphilis. By 1947, it had become the standard treatment. Around the same time, syphilis control efforts across the United States were expanding. Screening programs, mobile clinics, public health campaigns. A national reflex was forming. Find it, treat it, stop the spread. But one group was kept outside that reflex: the Tuskegee subjects. From the mid-1930s onward, the Tuskegee study was openly published in America's most respected medical journals. Those publications continued for years. After 1953, papers co-authored or first authored by nurse Eunice were added to that literature as well. During this period, two major ethical frameworks meant to protect human subjects had been established: the Nuremberg Code and the World Health Organization's Declaration of Helsinki. And yet, ending the Tuskegee study was never seriously placed on the table at any stage. Even the Centers for Disease Control, which took over oversight from the United States Public Health Service, actively decided to continue the study as late as 1969. Hundreds of health workers, researchers, and administrators knew about the study's existence and scope. They all knew what would happen to these men if they did not receive real treatment. But here's the crucial distinction. The study was discussed in scientific circles, while the men inside the study didn't even know they were in an experiment. Over those years, some subjects died of syphilis. Some were forced to live with heart failure, strokes, blindness, or severe cognitive decline caused by the disease. Over the years, out of the hundreds of people who witnessed this process, no one said out loud, "This is unethical." In 1966, that silence broke for the first time. A government employee, Peter Buxton, an epidemiologist working within the United States Public Health Service, learned about the Tuskegee study and filed a written objection to his superiors. He said the study was unethical, harmful, and had to be stopped immediately. The response he received was blunt: "This study is scientifically necessary." But Buxton didn't give up. For years, he kept pursuing the issue. By the late 1960s, he took the matter to the press. In 1972, an Associated Press report brought the Tuskegee study into the public eye for the first time. America was shaken. A year later, in 1973, an independent advisory panel formed by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare investigated the study. Their decision was clear. This study is ethically unjustified. Because the knowledge gained was never proportional to the known risks to human subjects. The Tuskegee study was officially terminated, and for the survivors, decades later, treatment finally began. Final stop. Why did so many people never react? The answer to that question isn't because they were all evil. In fact, that's what makes this story so disturbing. Many of the people involved didn't feel immoral. They felt moral. Because in their minds, a balance had been built. The suffering of a group of people in exchange for knowledge that will save thousands, even millions of lives. And that belief was institutionally rewarded. Some of the people who worked on Tuskegee, who helped steer it, later received awards connected to the Guatemala experiments, where people were deliberately infected with syphilis. Their academic reputations rose, their careers advanced. There was another soothing factor. These men didn't appear to be completely abandoned. Their pain was managed. Some symptoms temporarily eased, but in reality, nothing changed. Because the issue wasn't whether they suffered less. The issue was that they were deliberately not cured, even though they could have been. In those same years, similar ideas were circulating in other American medical institutions. For example, at Stanford University School of Medicine, some physicians believed latent syphilis was being overtreated, that there wasn't enough evidence of treatment effectiveness at that stage, and that most of these patients didn't experience significant physical harm. According to this view, much of the suffering wasn't caused by the disease itself, but by the stigma attached to syphilis. Those ideas didn't make Tuskegee look like an exception. They fed the feeling that not everyone is treated anyway, and that created something powerful, a silent legitimacy. Everyone involved placed ethical responsibility on someone else's shoulders. I'm just collecting the data. I'm just in the field. I'm just writing the paper. I didn't make the decision. And so, for years, no one stood up from the table. There was a moment when the study stopped asking new questions, but it didn't stop, because stopping would mean admitting that the line had already been crossed long ago. If the experiment stopped, it wouldn't just be a study that ended. It would be a worldview treated as right for years that would have to be questioned. After the experiment. After the Tuskegee study was exposed in the press in 1972, the study was officially terminated. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the men who had participated in the study and their families. The case ended in a settlement. Approximately $10 million in compensation was paid to surviving participants and their families. No doctor was prosecuted. No administrator was punished. No decision-maker accepted personal responsibility. Some names were removed from public buildings. Some awards were withdrawn. Institutional apology statements were issued. In 1974, the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program was established for surviving participants. Under the program, free medical care was provided, and over time, its scope was expanded to include health-related social support. In 1997, the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, formally apologized to the surviving participants and their families in a ceremony held at the White House. This was the first and only explicit federal-level apology. Tuskegee deeply damaged the trust Black communities in America had in the government and the healthcare system. That distrust was passed down through generations. Even today, one of the reasons for low Black participation in clinical research in the United States is this historical memory. And here is the irony. Even after the Tuskegee study became a symbol of ethical violations, some of the people involved in the study continued to receive academic awards and maintain their reputations through other research. Zoom out. This isn't a story about hunting for a villain. It's a story about human limits and how systems shape our choices. Now let's pull back. Judging centuries of ethical and moral values through a single experiment is not enough. What we need to look at instead is this. What everyday conditions made certain actions feel normal to the people inside that system? In psychology and ethics literature, this is called moral normalization. The longer a situation repeats, the more people participate in it. The more institutions support it, the less it gets questioned. That is exactly what happened in Tuskegee. The people involved believed they were producing knowledge that would save thousands, even millions of lives. This is a well-known ethical drift. The end justifies the means. In psychology, this is called moral drift. Nothing becomes wrong all at once. Wrong becomes familiar through repetition. And this drift wasn't just individual. It was institutionally reinforced through awards, academic titles, and career advancement. At this point, moral imagination should intervene. Moral imagination is the ability to place ourselves in the position of the person at risk, to see what happens to them not as abstract data, but as a concrete human life. But groupthink, institutional obedience, tribal loyalty, and hierarchy erode that ability. A person may ignore things in a group that they would find clearly wrong on their own. In the Tuskegee Project, many physicians served consecutively over the years. Even if some felt discomfort about the risks imposed on the subjects, they continued working on the project. Because feeling ethical discomfort is not the same as taking ethical action. This condition is called moral inertia, being carried by the momentum of an established routine, choosing not to act. Breaking moral inertia is difficult. Challenging established routines, official policies, and the feeling of "this existed before me" comes at a high cost. And here another mechanism enters: blaming the victim. There was a belief that people with syphilis deserved what happened to them. That belief made this possible, seeing the suffering of others as less urgent, less tragic, less like us. When morality is fragmented, no one feels fully responsible. What made the Tuskegee study possible was not a few bad people. What made it possible was morality being distributed across a system. And this mindset wasn't unique to Alabama. In Guatemala, in Indiana, vulnerable groups were turned into tools for scientific goals, under the same logic. When people fail to intervene in the face of serious injustice, the real reason is often a lack of will. If this study had not been exposed to the press, it would have continued until the last subject died and an autopsy was performed. From beginning to end, over nearly 40 years, the only person who remained in the field was one nurse, Eunice Rivers. And that is why this story is still disturbing, because years later, looking back and saying, "I wouldn't have done that," is easy. Hindsight is comforting but misleading. In real time, while inside that system, maintaining the same clarity is much harder. Putting ourselves in Peter Buxton's place is easy. But looking from the position of Nurse Eunice Rivers, standing at the center of acceptance, belonging, and reward, is far more unsettling. Is it enough to call her evil? Or are we looking at the mistake of a citizen who was accepted for the first time in a post-slavery society, rewarded for aligning with the existing moral framework? This channel knows that judging from hindsight is shallow. The question is this: if you were inside the same system with the same justifications, taking the same reasonable steps, while surrounded by centuries-old worldviews, a study accepted by hundreds of professionals, an experiment believed to serve the nation, what would you choose? This isn't an accusation, it's a confrontation. This is a channel for people who choose not to judge from far away, but to ask, what could have happened in that moment? If you want to think through more stories like this with us, don't forget to subscribe. And in the comments, we want to ask you, at that time, in that experiment, if you were there, would you truly have made a different choice?